Queensland Health now says a 30-year-old man who died in Blackwater did not have coronavirus. Restaurants and pubs, zoos, pools and beauty salons among businesses reopening as more coronavirus restrictions lifted across Australia. And the communications breakdown that left Victorian fire crews frustrated when the summer bushfires jumped the Murray. Hello, I'm Yvonne Yong with ABC News. In the United States, mayors are calling for peace and more curfews are being imposed in cities across the country, but violent protests have continued for a sixth night. The National Guard is again out in more than 21 states, and there's anger at the actions of some police cracking down on demonstrators. 2 officers in Atlanta have been charged for using excessive force, and people have been back out on the streets of New York, Boston and Los Angeles. There have now been protests in at least 140 cities, and stores have been looted in Philadelphia and Santa Monica in broad daylight. Alongside many state authorities, Donald Trump has condemned the violence, and he was rushed to an underground bunker as protesters gathered outside the White House. From Washington, North America correspondent David Lipson reports, and a warning: some scenes in this story are very confronting.
And here's that video, Jennifer. Oh my gosh, the speed at which that truck approached.
What started as a fight for justice has descended into chaos. On a Minnesota freeway, a tanker speeds directly toward a crowd of protesters, narrowly avoiding catastrophe. Protesters chase down the truck and swarm over the cabin. Eventually, the driver is dragged out and beaten by the mob. Before police arrive, dispersing the crowd and taking the driver into custody. 75 cities are living through these protests. Many are in flames. More than half have imposed curfews. In Atlanta, 2 officers have been fired for using excessive force, arresting 2 young African Americans. Body cam footage shows the woman screaming for help. In Michigan, every car on this street is on fire, windows smashed, tear gas deployed.
Tell your brothers and sisters, we will not win this fight with guns. It's not going to happen. We got to be peaceful.
Tear gas and rubber bullets too. In the beachside community of Santa Monica, 1,000 National Guard soldiers are patrolling LA streets, helping 20,000 police on the ground. With so much division, chaotic confrontations have been taking place across the country.
Well, this is the centre of Washington, D.C., the capital city of the world's most powerful nation. And as you can see, the people have just totally taken over. No matter what the police and other authorities do across America to try to stamp down on this protest movement, it seems that it keeps springing back up.
Protesters have defied Washington's first curfew. The National Guard deployed, but hundreds demonstrated as close to the White House as they could. One thing is bringing protesters together. People all over the country have started kneeling, a symbolic protest against police brutality. Now even police are joining in. George Floyd was the match that lit this explosion of violence. It's now taken a life of its own, and even further charges against the others involved in his death may not be enough to stop it. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
Well, Mark Claxton is a retired detective with the New York Police Department and current director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance, and he says images of officers joining protesters on bended knees further demonstrates the need for police reform.
What it tells me is this moment is different than any other moment in our history. There have been many cases of brutality, police brutality and police criminality, especially as it pertains to the killing of Black and brown people. But this is the first time that I can recall in my lifetime that the law enforcement community has joined the civilian community in expressing complete displeasure and demanding for further justice against their own colleagues in law enforcement. I think it would be wise for us to utilize this moment as an opportunity to begin not only the discussion about police reform, but the implementation of those ideas and measures that can make that a reality.
Well, the US president has blamed a left-wing group for the violence at the protests. It's known as Antifa, and Donald Trump is vowing to designate it as a terrorist organisation. But as Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams reports, it may not be that simple, and the political stakes for the president are rising by the day.
While the burning and looting has shocked the nation, it's also divided those on the front lines of the protests.
Ain't nobody coming to protect us.
Let me tell you,
we got to start our own life.
I understand, but let me tell you something right here. This 16, he's 16.
And they gonna kill him next week.
He's 16.
What we gonna do?
You tell me.
What we gonna do?
This ain't the way.
Many see this as opportunistic looting, taking advantage of a stretched police force and nothing to do with the actual protest. But President Trump sees a far-left conspiracy to attack American values, and he singled out the left-wing Antifa group, saying it was responsible for the violence and destruction. He tweeted, "The United States of America will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organisation. These people are anarchists." There are elements of Antifa who in recent years have armed themselves to combat what they see as a threat of fascism and racism. It's a loose alliance of like-minded groups with no formal structure or leadership.
Done with people like you.
And there have been isolated attacks on those seen as right-wing opponents. But here it appears protesters are handing over a man said to be an Antifa supporter to the police. But for many taking to the streets in countless American cities, this is not about politics, but confronting deep-seated racism.
We are living in a country that has, for a long time, brutalized African Americans, from slavery to lynching to Jim Crow to mass incarceration and now to police brutality.
For President Trump, the turmoil is both a danger and an opportunity. The risk is being seen as impotent, unable to restore order in this fractured country. But by identifying Antifa as the enemy, he has a target he says is responsible for the violence. And the original outrage, a black man killed by police, is more easily lost in the smoke and mirrors of an intense political blame game. Philip Williams, ABC News.
Demonstrators have hit the streets of some European cities in solidarity with US protesters. In Berlin, hundreds of people marched past the Brandenburg Gate and onto the US Embassy. Demonstrators in Copenhagen used banners saying Black Lives Matter. And in London, there were large crowds in Trafalgar Square. Physical distancing was abandoned, raising concerns about the possible spread of coronavirus in one of the worst affected countries. Europe correspondent Samantha Hawley reports.
As the protests raged in the US, in London hundreds took to the streets, marching from Trafalgar Square to the US Embassy.
Why can't the government protect us as much as they want to protect Dominic Cummings?
Social distancing disappeared as the anger bubbled over. But still, in the UK, the coronavirus crisis is dominating, with the death toll now passing 38,000. For months, Boris Johnson has been criticised for not doing more to contain the virus.
Good evening.
Now he's been warned again that he's moving too fast as lockdown restrictions are lifted further. This week in England, primary schools will reopen for reception, Year 1 and Year 6 students. Gatherings of up to 6 people will be allowed outdoors, and 2 million vulnerable residents who've been shielding will be allowed outside.
Obviously, this is a sensitive moment, but we can't just stay in lockdown forever.
But it's the scientists who aren't happy, and at least 4 members of the government's advisory group have spoken out. On Twitter, one of them, Jeremy Farrar, declared COVID-19 is spreading too fast to lift the lockdown in England.
Last week alone, there was 17,000 new COVID-19 cases across the UK.
the second highest rate in Europe after Sweden, which has a herd immunity policy. It's thought it will take 2 to 3 weeks before it's known if the lockdown easing has pushed the infection rate up. Samantha Hawley, ABC News, London.
Queensland Health has confirmed further tests show 30-year-old Nathan Turner did not have coronavirus before he died last week. They had previously stated the man returned a positive test after his death, which prompted the setup of fever clinics and deployment of contact tracers to the central Queensland town of Blackwater. An autopsy report shows the Emerald miner, who had underlying health issues, tested negative to COVID-19, and his cause of death is yet to be established. Now, this takes the Queensland death toll down to 6 from the previous 7. It might have been a miserable first day of winter, but it was also the first day of new freedoms, and Victorians went out to celebrate. Many flocked to pubs and cafes, which opened their doors to dine-in customers for the first time since the lockdown was announced 8 weeks ago. Here's Bridget Rollerson.
As the clock struck midnight, customers hungry to leave the house were more than ready.
We miss the feeling, you know? So it's nice to be out of the house, finally.
I already booked also for tomorrow as well.
Restaurants welcomed them back with open arms.
I'm very excited because we've been doing takeaways, but it's not the same.
By lunchtime, tradies were queuing at pubs for a long-awaited pot and palmer.
We've missed it, that's for sure.
Winter weather didn't stop some people rushing to pools.
We've had people emailing us, calling us, asking us when it's going to open.
Victoria's zoos are also open again, with some young inhabitants having to adjust to visitors.
These gates have been quiet, and suddenly to have the noise of kids and members and people showing up, it's incredibly exciting.
Melbourne aquarium staff weren't taking any chances, as fans were jumping out of their skin to get inside. The new rules mean high-risk businesses like beauty salons have to be prepared.
We've gone full bedroll, which will be replaced every client, gloves, face masks. We've got a temperature checker.
While the Premier had lunch with the Lord Mayor today, he warned with another 4 cases of coronavirus in Victoria overnight, life is not back to normal.
It's far from over. We've still got a long way to go, and it's not a matter of going back to normal. We have to find a COVID normal.
At this Ballarat cafe, the new rules mean there's a limit of 20 customers and physical distancing is compulsory. Contact details must be recorded and no long lunches.
Time limits and sort of understanding that obviously we have a business to run as well, so not being sort of too rude about the fact that they need to be in and out.
And not all businesses will survive.
It'll be very different. It's probably a fifth of what we're used to sitting.
We believe that between 10 and 30% of businesses will permanently close by 30 March of next year, unless the federal government continues the JobKeeper program.
Restrictions will ease again in 3 weeks if community transmission remains low. Bridget Rollerson, ABC News, Melbourne.
Well, Australia didn't see any major increase in cases after the first stage of restrictions was eased. It will be some time before we see if much bigger steps taken today by many states will spark a new wave. Here's Casey Briggs with a look at Australia's curve.
8 new cases today, that's all we've seen so far, and most of those, all 3 in New South Wales, this one in the west and one of Victoria's 4, are the least worrying kind of coronavirus case. They're in overseas arrivals who have been in hotel quarantine since they entered the country. This chart shows you all of Australia's new infections going back 4 weeks. About a fifth of these are in New South Wales, but the majority, almost 2/3 of them, are in Victoria. That state is now the single biggest contributor to Australia's case curve. We now have just 20 people in hospital with COVID-19 in Australia, and the better news is only one of those is in a serious